Hello class, this is Chapter 3, Globalization and Diversity, North America. I am Adjunct Professor Wade Renando. I hope you've enjoyed the first two chapters. We're going to be going into specific chapters on regions now. The first two covered broad topics including mapping and cartography and the global environment, and now we're going to be focusing on a specific region starting with North America. North America consists of, at least in our book, Canada and the United States. Geographically, the continent of North America includes Mexico and Central America as well, but for the purposes of our book, the region of North America culturally and historically will be the United States and Canada. This is a region that has about 360 million people living in North America in those two countries, and it's the largest consumer of natural resources on Earth. It's made up of many significant landforms. Landforms are major geographic features, which includes the Great Lakes, the Great Prairie in the center, the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, and low-lying lands on the East Coast, and also lots of tundra and prairie and major mountain ranges in the north as well. So a very diversified landscape. This is a satellite image of the Great Lakes taken from space, and below is a picture of the Rocky Mountains. There are again vast interior lowlands and mountains in the east and west, the Rockies and the Appalachians, and extensive low-lying plains in the east, and a drier environment in the west along the California coast. Then as you get further north, it becomes a marine climate as it gets wetter when you get to Oregon and Washington and Seattle. The picture in the top left are pictures of barrier islands off of Virginia, and the bottom right are mountains in the Pacific Northwest. So North America is a continent, again, that has a wide variety of climates. This is the Köppen model of classifying different climates. This is the one that has different letters A, B, C, and D. A is tropical, B is deserts and prairies, C is mid-latitude mild, D is a continental climate. And as you can see here, there's a wide variety of climates here. Where we are in Michigan would be a continental climate, and in the southeast there's a mid-latitude mild climate. On the far west in California, there's a Mediterranean climate, which means you have dry summers and cool, drizzly winters. Mid-latitude mild. On the southeast is the opposite. It has rainier summers and cooler, drier winters. And of course, in the prairie, you have wide open areas with relatively little rain, enough rain to support grass, but not enough to support major trees. And then you also have deserts in the southwest. Desert is usually less than 5 inches of rain per year. So a wide variety of climates in North America. North America has had an economy that has gone through major transitions, especially since the early 1990s. It was a major industrial economy and still is, but now there's much more global competition in industry than there was 20, 30 years ago. Some people have described North America as a post-industrial economy. That's not entirely true. After China, the United States still produces more products and manufactures more goods than anyone else, but there aren't as many people employed in manufacturing as there once were. And there are other major centers of manufacturing outside the United States. After World War II, during the 1950s, much of Europe was devastated by World War II. Korea still didn't have a developed industrial economy, neither did Japan. Japan was also struggling to rebuild from World War II. So during the 1950s, the U.S. was far and away the preeminent industrial country in the world. But as the world pulled itself out of World War II and built up its economy, and with the end of the Cold War, other countries started to develop and improve their economies. And now the U.S. has much more global competition in manufacturing than it once did. The bottom left picture here is the Mall of America. This is a massive mall south of Minneapolis. That's an example of a very successful mall, and it shows how a service economy has taken over many parts of the country from an industrial manufacturing economy. And the right is an abandoned plant in Detroit called the Packard plant. This was a massive manufacturing plant that opened in 1903, closed in 1958, and has basically been used for very smaller industrial purposes till the mid-80s, when it was more or less abandoned. A Spanish investor recently purchased it and is in the process of developing it into a combination of residential, retail, offices, and perhaps light industry and recreation. So there's hope that this massive multi-block section of Detroit might become productive again and not an abandoned place that it is now. Interestingly enough, the Packard plant has been used for weddings. There are a lot of people who have an interest in urban decay. In fact, it's so common there's even a word for it. It's called ruin porn. And there are a lot of people who like to photograph old decrepit buildings, and people find this interesting. Detroit's notorious for it. Cleveland has some to a smaller extent. But hopefully Detroit can be built up and be known for something other than abandoned buildings. Detroit actually is in the middle of a building boom, at least along the Midtown section, the downtown area, and the area a little bit north of downtown along the new light rail line. There are many new apartments that are going up and many luxury condominiums, so at least part of Detroit in the downtown central area is getting better, while the outer neighborhoods are still struggling. From 2000 to 2009, Michigan lost about 805,000 manufacturing jobs. That is 1 in every 6 jobs in Michigan, or 17.2% of all the jobs in the state. Ohio was also hurt by the Great Recession. The Great Recession started technically in 2008, but Michigan and Ohio started losing some manufacturing jobs even before that. Ohio lost almost 10% of the jobs during the same amount of time. And what has happened is we've had an increase in service jobs not related to manufacturing. Could be working in a call center, could be working retail, such as at a mall, such as the Mall of America. And service jobs have been growing, but they often don't pay as well as unionized factory jobs did 20 or 30 years ago. So Michigan is in the process of moving away from an industrial economy towards a service-oriented economy, although we still do have a fair amount of industrialization and manufacturing jobs in the state. American car companies are doing better now than they were during 2008 and 2009 when GM and Chrysler had to declare bankruptcy. We have benefited from relatively inexpensive gas, which means the sale of gas-guzzling trucks and SUVs that the U.S. does well selling have been pretty steady, while the more fuel-efficient economic cars that generally foreign countries do better at have done not as well. As if gas is cheap and trucks are selling, that's good generally for the big three. U.S. car sales are down in August of 2007 compared to the same time in 2006. Ford is down 7.4% in 2007 compared to 2017 compared to 2016, and GM is down 15% in 2007 compared to 2016. This is fairly common. Automobile companies are rather cyclical. If you had a big year last year, people just don't need as much of a new car as they once did. And sometimes after a few good years, inevitably, car companies struggle for a few years. Also, younger people, millennials, are waiting longer to buy cars or not purchasing cars or using rideshare services. So the number of people purchasing cars between, say, 18 and 25 is lower now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Students are also struggling with high student loan burdens and high rent, and that means you have less money to spend on cars. So car sales have been doing fairly well since 2009, but struggling a little bit the last year. And some people worry there may be a long-term trend where simply fewer people start buying cars. North America is a continent that has been significantly transformed by industrialization and human activity. And it has also struggled with pollution and environmental disasters such as Hurricane Katrina and recently Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Maria that hit Puerto Rico, and also Hurricane Irma that hit Florida. 2017 has been a very bad year for hurricanes. We had several years where we had very low hurricane activity due to luck, and our luck ran out, and this year we're having a worse than usual year when it came to hurricane activity. But even before this year, Hurricane Katrina hurt New Orleans in 2005. There was a problem with the Deepwater Horizon oil rig explosion that blew up. There was also floodwaters in 2011 and a Flint water crisis that is still ongoing So North America, like many parts of the world, have struggled with different environmental issues that they have had to deal with. 2005 is when, again, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. About 80% of the city was flooded. Most of New Orleans is actually below sea level. They have levees to hold back the water. During this disaster, 1,500 people died in the flood. That is significantly worse than the number of people who died in Houston this year and Puerto Rico and Florida combined. The number of people who died in those three incidences has been confirmed at least so far as several hundred, which of course is several hundred too many, but it's significantly less than New Orleans. The French Quarter, the oldest part of New Orleans, was built on higher ground because usually you build on the highest ground first and then the more marginal ground is built on later. So it's very common to have historic neighborhoods often on the best land in an area. So the historic part of New Orleans was largely undamaged, while the poorer areas that were more low-lying, like the Ninth Ward, flooded and were damaged significantly. The levees that were supposed to protect the city breached, and that caused the flooding. And even today, New Orleans population is significantly less than it was before the flood. The city of New Orleans, interestingly, was founded in 1718 by French traders. Now, after the city was rebuilding, or as it is still rebuilding, nonprofit agencies and federal laws have tried to encourage people in New Orleans to build more resilient homes, ones that are less likely to flood. And many of them are now built off the ground. So you would park your car at ground level, and then the main living area would be about 10 feet off the ground. So this is common in New Orleans, and it's also been common in parts of the Florida Keys. This is also something that's important. If we're going to rebuild homes in Houston, in Florida, we probably should build them in areas that are elevated if they're in areas that are prone to flooding. So hopefully when we rebuild some of the homes in Florida and in Texas, we'll rebuild them in a way that's more resilient than what they previously were. Flint, Michigan is a city that about 2 years ago dealt with lead poisoning in its water because of old pipes that were not properly coated with a chemical that would have prevented lead from the pipes from leaking into the water. It seems as though Governor Snyder may have known about it before he became public with it, and it is still currently being investigated. But this is an example of how different environmental problems related to water contamination can be a problem, especially in industrial cities like Flint. Lansing, interestingly enough, several years ago, before the Flint water crisis, removed all lead water service lines from the city in order to prevent something like what happened in Flint later on from happening in Lansing. So this is something that the federal government and state are still looking into and still dealing with. So in addition to some of the environmental issues we've talked about with North America, it is a region, like all regions of the world, that's dealing with rising sea levels, coastal erosions, glacial retreat, and indifference, at least for the moment, relative indifference from the federal government. Previously, when President Obama was president, the U.S. signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which set voluntary limits for different countries to follow when it comes to reducing greenhouse gases. President Trump has been skeptical of this and said he may pull out of it, although he hasn't yet, and he's been more questionable of renewable energies and more for fossil fuels such as coal compared to the Obama administration. This is an example of a glacier taken in 2040, taken in 1940 and 2009. And as you can see, in 1940, the glacier was significantly larger, and then it's retreated significantly in the picture below. This is at Glacier National Park. There's 1,558 square miles in that park. So this park is about twice the size of Jackson County, which is 724 square miles. So Glacier National Park, not surprisingly, is known for its glaciers, and many of them are retreating. In addition to global warming and rising sea levels, North America has also dealt with invasive species. A lot of parts of the world have dealt with this. These are plants or animals that are not originally from the area that move into an area and can cause significant problems and disruption. One of the most notorious invasive species in the Great Lakes are zebra mussels. These are originally from southern Russia, and it's thought that they came to the Great Lakes in probably 1988. They most likely came in a ship in ballast water. Ships will often take in water in order to increase their weight so they're more stable during storms, and then when the water is no longer needed, the water is released. So it's thought some boat may have taken water into its hull in Russia, gone into the Great Lakes, then released that water and gotten these little things into the Great Lakes. There are tiny crustaceans that look like itty bitty clams, and they just grow all over everything, including pipes, water intake valves, and even crayfish. And they do actually clean up the water. They filter plankton out of the water that makes the water cleaner, but that also takes a food source away from other animals. And you have to sometimes scrape them off of different machinery that they get on. Motorboats can be covered in these things, or again, water intake valves, sewage treatment plants, power plants. Any plant on the water can be attacked by these zebra mussels, and then you have to spend a significant amount of money to scrape them off different mechanical things. So they're a major problem that has gotten into the Great Lakes in the late 80s. On the plus side, they actually do make the water a lot more clear. In Traverse City, for instance, the water in the Traverse City Bay is clearer than now than it was in the mid-80s and elsewhere as well, partly because of zebra mussels. But the clear water means they're taking food away from other native species, so it's generally not good. Another disgusting invasive species are lamprey. These are weird eel-like creatures you see in the top right that attach themselves to the sides of fish, drill into their body, and then suck their blood out, sometimes killing them, sometimes just leaving them horribly scarred. They are originally from the Finger Lakes region of New York. They came here in the 1930s, and these have been knocked down significantly. People working for the DNR have developed chemicals that significantly reduce their numbers, and they have put them in streams where they were known to spawn. And their numbers are down significantly from, say, 30 years ago, although they are still a problem. Another problem invasive species is Asian carp. And these are these odd creatures originally from China that have these ugly eyeballs on the side of their heads. They were brought into Arkansas to be raised in fish farms, but then there were massive floods in the 70s and 80s, and they escaped, and they've gotten into the Missouri and the Mississippi River, and they spread throughout many rivers in the Great Lakes. And now they are making their way to Lake Michigan. Some scientists think that Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes are probably too cold to sustain these fish, and if they did make it there, they'd probably just die off when there's a cold winter, but others aren't so sure. The Illinois River that goes through Chicago once was so horribly polluted that fish wouldn't be able to swim up the river to get to Lake Michigan. But the Chicago River and the Illinois River are cleaner now than they were, so now it's conceivably possible that these fish could make their way into the Great Lakes and spread throughout the Great Lakes once they get there. So hopefully that won't happen. These fish are also unusual because they've been known when they hear motorboats, it agitates them and they often jump out of the water. So there are videos on YouTube of Asian carp jumping out of the water as motorboats go by. So the cost of modernization is North America has had some problems with, soil erosion, vegetation being transformed from its native way into something that's more industrial and not like it was originally several hundred years ago. And there's been a warming of the climate. So there have been negative effects due to human industrialization. The picture on the left is Los Angeles during a smoggy day. Smog in Los Angeles is actually significantly better now than it was in the 70s. Previously, in the 70s, there was lead in gasoline because it slightly improved the performance of gasoline. And that, of course, caused lead to be in the air. And then starting in the 70s and 80s, fuel economy standards went up, cars were forced to be cleaner, and the air in LA is actually significantly better now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. The picture on the right is of the Bakken oil field in North Dakota. This is a massive oil and natural gas field in North Dakota that has produced a significant amount of oil and natural gas that has helped improve the economy of North Dakota and also brought down the cost of natural gas, bringing down heating bills for some people. But it has also led to a massive glut of natural gas on the market, which has lowered the price to the point where some of these wells have actually been shut down because they're no longer profitable. So natural gas has allowed for the U.S. to produce a new, relatively inexpensive form of energy, but it also releases methane, a very potent greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. So it's somewhat of a trade-off. In addition to mining for natural gas, there are also open pit mines that look for coal and gold and other natural resources that have significantly transformed the landscape of North America. The top picture is the Twin Creek Gold Mine in Nevada. And the bottom picture is interesting. That's the Ludington Pumped Storage Power Plant. And that stores energy and creates an artificial lake that holds 27 billion gallons of water. And what that does is, when there's an excess amount of electricity in the grid, when there's more electricity than there is demand, water is pulled from Lake Michigan up into this large reservoir. And then when demand is high and the available electricity is lower, it is opened up. Water, because of gravity, is pulled through turbines where it goes back into Lake Michigan. So essentially, this artificial lake acts as a large electrical storage battery. And there are other artificial lakes like this in certain parts of the world that are used to store electricity, but they're fairly rare because you have to have just the right conditions. You need to have a hill near a large body of water, and you need to have an area where there's an excess amount of electricity so you can pump the water up. So it is a relatively simple, low-tech way of storing energy, but it's not commonly used because you need just the right conditions to make it economical. So North America, when the Europeans first arrived, was a vast area covered by grassland. Much of the area has now been transformed with crops that were imported from outside of North America, including wheat. Wheat is originally from the Middle East. It has a very high caloric value. It's a plant that is very healthy, and you can grow a lot of calories in a small amount of space. It's an example of an imported seed that has been brought to North America. There have also been some plants from the Americas that have been brought to the rest of the world, including corn and tomatoes and potatoes. Those were brought from the Americas to Europe and elsewhere. So before the late 1500s, there were no tomatoes in Italy or anywhere in Europe. Modern agriculture with imported seeds has allowed what used to be an open prairie and grasslands to be transformed into very profitable and productive farmland. The picture on the bottom left is a picture from space of a farm in Kansas where they have something called a pivot irrigation system, a center pivot irrigation system. That is when you have like a large arm that circles around like a clock and sprays an area with water, and then that's how they grow crops. If you're in an area where water is a little scarce, this can be an efficient way of growing food in areas where water is somewhat scarce, such as Kansas, Nebraska, and elsewhere. It's not used as much in Michigan because the water is more abundant. The massive water source that the south central part of the U.S. has, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, and so on, is something called the Ogallala Aquifer. This is an aquifer is a large underground body of water where you usually have a significant amount of soil that's kind of spongy that has water in it. And then you can pull water from underground up to the surface and use it for different purposes such as municipal water systems and farming. And this massive aquifer is a main water source for parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. But the water is being depleted faster than it can naturally replenish itself. It's been estimated that it would take about 6,000 years to replenish naturally what has been taken from this aquifer over the last 200 years. So if you stopped pulling water from it, in order to get to where it was before we started pulling water out of it, that might take about 6,000 years. So many people are concerned that we're pulling water out of this aquifer faster than it can replenish, and it might run out sometime in the next several decades. Another source other than farming that uses a significant amount of water are golf courses. And this is interesting. There are about 14,000 golf courses in the U.S. They went on a massive golf course building binge in the 90s and early O's, just like they overbuilt malls during this time. They overbuilt golf courses too. People kept thinking the sport would grow and grow because Tiger Woods was making it popular in the early O's. And what happened is the popularity has actually declined. There are many reasons for this, mostly because young people don't have the time and they don't have the money. It's expensive golfing, and young people are straddled with student loan debt and stagnant wages and less time than previous generations. So due to a lack of money and a lack of time and changing tastes, the popularity of golf courses has been slowly declining, and some of them have actually been switched over to farmland. That happened in Ann Arbor. A couple golf courses a year or two ago were swapped over, and now they're growing corn where they previously had a golf course. But that is a massive consumer of water in certain parts of the country. Michigan has a large number of golf courses per capita. So these pictures here are an example of something called the urban heat island effect. And when you have a large built-up urban area, a very good example would be Houston or Atlanta or some of the southern Sunbelt cities that were very car-centric. This can cause the temperatures to be significantly warmer than the area around it. These pictures show New York City and the average temperature above what the average would be. Darker areas are actually cooler areas. If you look at the bottom picture, you can see where Central Park is. Central Park is right here. That's a strip of vegetation surrounded by concrete. And where you have vegetation, you often have cooler temperatures, but where you have glass and concrete and cars, that tends to absorb heat, and that can significantly increase the temperature of cities. So cities at night can be 9 to 14 degrees hotter Fahrenheit than rural areas around them, forests and farmland and so on. New York had a very bad heat wave in 1896. The heat wave killed about 1,500 people. And what happened is tenants, this was a big boom city in 1896. People from Europe and all over were moving to New York City to look for work. There were no restrictions on immigration. Anyone who showed up, with few exceptions, was allowed into the country. And often many of them crammed into incredibly cramped apartments in New York, the Upper East and Upper West Side. And this led to very dangerous conditions. And when this massive heat wave came, a lot of people died in the heat wave that happened. Some people could have been saved if they simply would have gone to a public park and slept, but the police wouldn't let people sleep in parks at the time because they thought that was basically homelessness, and they weren't going to tolerate that. So anyway, this heat wave killed about 1,500 people. Atlanta, like Miami, like Houston and Dallas and other large Sunbelt cities that grew after the mid-20th century, have a massive amount of suburban sprawl. Many of them lack vegetation, they lack public parks and so on. And because of that, they have had hotter temperatures and are very vulnerable to this heat island effect. The region's average commuter spends 127 hours on the road every day in Atlanta, and it's very bad in Washington, D.C. also, New York City, L.A., and many major car-centric cities have very bad traffic congestion, and people can easily spend 3 hours in traffic going to and from work in big metro areas. In Atlanta in 2012, there was a proposition, a ballot initiative where you'd pay 1 cent sales tax for the region in order to pay for mass transit, but unfortunately it went down. People in Atlanta supported it, but some people in the suburbs that had their own cars didn't think they would benefit from it or use mass transit, and it went down by a relatively slim margin. Last year in 2016, during the presidential election, there was also a ballot initiative in the Detroit metro area where a very similar mass transit system was proposed, where there would be Property tax increase on homes in the Detroit metro area. That would be used to build up commuter rail lines and bus rapid transit systems, basically high-speed buses. And that also went down by a very narrow margin, by about less than 2%. So sometimes it's difficult to get funding for mass transit passed. But some cities are building up their mass transit. Atlanta does have a light rail line. Los Angeles has a massive mass transit ballot initiative that they passed, and they're in the process of expanding their mass transit. Seattle, Washington are expanding their subways. So many cities in the U.S. are building up mass transit systems as a way of alleviating traffic congestion and reducing rush hour traffic. The bottom picture shows a picture of Atlanta. The areas in red are areas that are significantly affected by the heat island effect. And the more vegetation you have, the more you can mitigate the damage and the cause of the heat island effect. So costs of human modification. This is something that's a little easier to read in your book, but basically these are major environmental issues that are facing the country and the region: acid rain, the depletion of the Olagala aquifer along with other aquifers, oil spills in the Atlantic have been a major problem. Droughts in the Southwest were a major problem. I mean, just today, California has had a wildfire that erupted and has killed 10 people, and that wildfires out west can be very dangerous. So, like all regions of the world, North America has dealt with different environmental issues, some of which are aggravated by pollution and anthropogenic modifications to the continent and global warming. Acid rain is a problem that is caused by coal-fired power plants where pollution and CO2 is released into the atmosphere, and other pollutants and other chemicals from coal gets into the atmosphere, and then it comes down as essentially poison contaminated rain, and that can lead to water quality being degraded and forests being destroyed. Acid rain, thankfully, is actually slowly on the decline. Coal-fired power plants have been slowly phased out, replaced by wind, solar, and natural gas. We have tighter emission standards that were passed when George H.W. Bush was president, and Barack Obama and others. And acid rain is not as bad as it was before, but still a significant problem. Also, there have been forests that have been able to recover from acid rain once the source of pollution has stopped. So parts of Canada especially were hard hit by acid rain. Coal-fired power plants were phased out, or new protections were put in place to make them better, and some of the forests have recovered because of that. So fracking, we talked a little earlier about this massive natural gas oil field in North Dakota. Pennsylvania also has natural gas underground, and in order to extract the natural gas, a process called hydraulic fracturing or fracking is sometimes used. This is when you drill a hole deep under the ground and then you tilt this hole, and so it's parallel to the surface, and then you line these holes, which are in shale where natural gas is, with explosives. You blow them up underground, and that releases some of the natural gas that's locked up in these rocks, and then you can pull it up to the surface. This has helped reduce the cost of natural gas in the U.S. and made our country more energy independent, but it also has the side effects of creating a lot of contaminated water, causing occasional earthquakes when you have these explosions and water being pushed down and extracted. And also occasionally, in extreme cases, you have situations where natural gas from underground starts to leak into people's water supply, and that can actually cause water to be contaminated with natural gas and even become flammable in certain situations. There are many incidences of people in Pennsylvania that have had water from their home faucet that has become flammable because of water being contaminated by natural gas underground. Some ways of improving energy efficiencies and expanding new sources of energy are renewable sources of energy such as wind and solar and geothermal and so on. A lot of states have adopted renewable energy portfolios. These are basically standards that require certain states to get a certain percentage of their energy from renewable sources. Michigan has a policy where we needed to get 10% of our energy from renewable sources by 2015. We reached that because of a combination of wind, a little bit of solar, geothermal, and so on. And now we've talked about having a new 15% renewable by the year 2025, which the state of Michigan is debating now. But the cost of renewable energy, especially wind and solar, has dropped significantly since about 2008. The picture on the bottom left is new U.S. energy capacity. As you can see, this is new energy capacity in gigawatts starting in 2008. And in 2008, about 40 gigawatts of new energy capacity from renewable sources was implemented, and then it's gone up and up and up every year. And in 2016, there have been about 145 new gigawatts of energy from wind and solar, and also geothermal and biomass to some degree. But solar and wind especially are growing very rapidly. The price is coming down, and in many parts of the country it's already competitive with coal and natural gas. So pollution is actually much better now than it was a generation or two ago. You don't always hear about the good news on the news, but compared to, say, the 1960s and 70s, the air and water is cleaner than it was a generation or two ago. In 1969, Cleveland, Ohio, had a river called the Cuyahoga River that actually caught on fire because there was so much pollution in oil and gasoline in it that it caught on fire, and that wasn't even that unusual for the time. But that really brought attention to how bad pollution was, and shortly after that, a massive grassroots protest movement called Earth Day started in 1970. This was a large movement where people were essentially demanding better quality of standards for air and water and new policies to fight pollution. And then in 1972, Congress and President Nixon passed the Clean Water Act. And what this did is it started cracking down on pollution and requiring that companies get permits if they were to pollute, and then they'd have to essentially pay for pollution that they generated. And then that revenue was used to discourage pollution and raise revenue tax dollars to fund cleanup programs that helped clean up the air and water. So Earth Day and the Clean Water Act was actually very important to improving the water and air quality in our country. The U.S. and Canada have had significant improvements in air and water quality in the last 40 years. We are still having some problems, though. Recently, Lake Erie has had a large algae bloom, and they've had this for several years now. This is when fertilizer runoff from farms and suburban lawns gets into different rivers that empty into Lake Erie. Then these fertilizers create algae blooms that absorb a lot of the oxygen from the lake, and that can lead to a massive die-off of fish in areas that are affected by it. And this has been a problem for a couple years now in the western part of Lake Erie, and it looks like it's happening again this year. So we've made some progress, but there's still a lot of progress to do. For sustainable agriculture, we mentioned how large farms often use large amounts of herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, and there's been somewhat of a movement away from this towards organic food and food that you can grow in your neighborhood and in your backyard and even on rooftops. So and there's been an organic food movement, and these are new sources of food that don't use the chemicals and herbicides that are theoretically better for you. Some of these have sprung up in Detroit, in New York. There are a lot of rooftop gardens and community gardens. So really all across the country there has been a greater interest and attention devoted to where our food comes from and making sure our food is safe and as local as possible. I myself have a pretty decent sized garden in my backyard. I grow lots of beans and spinach and kale and lettuce, and it's actually a very fun hobby if you have the time and the land to do so. So here are some more specific examples of renewable energy. Renewable energy include hydroelectric power. That's the Hoover Dam that was built during the 1930s on the top. The Hoover Dam generates A significant amount of electricity that's used in the Southwest, especially in Las Vegas and Colorado, and in big cities in the Southwest, a lot of them get electricity from the Hoover Dam. Solar, that's become significantly cheaper since roughly 2008. People are installing solar panels on their rooftops. There are large commercial-sized solar farms that have gone up. The casino near Battle Creek has a large battery of solar power panels near the freeway. You can drive past them and you can see them. What is that? It's not Soaring Eagle. Well, the casino, Firekeeper Casino has a large bunch of solar panels there. The idea is that way if they lose power, if the a power line is knocked down, they still have solar power to keep the machines running because electricity, they lose a lot of money. And then in the bottom left, you have a large group of wind turbines. And on the bottom right, you have a geothermal plant in Iceland. Iceland has a lot of volcanic activity. That means they have a lot of underground heat that they can use to create steam that can be used to generate electricity. So if you can have geothermal energy, it's a very reliable form of energy. It doesn't work everywhere. You have to have the unique geography to have it. So solar power in the U.S. is about 1.5% of our energy, but growing very quickly. California has massive solar power plants that they've been building. A very large one was built in 2013. There are different kinds of solar power. The bottom picture on this tile is solar panels. This takes sunlight and converts it directly into electricity. And on the top is something a little different. This is solar thermal energy. What this does is this power plant has large curved mirrors that focus the sun's rays on a large long tube of oil, and then the heat from the sun heats up the oil, and that generates steam, and that is used to generate electricity. So two different methods that are used for taking solar energy and making electricity. Solar panels take the sun and directly convert it into electricity, and other forms of solar energy called solar thermal take the sun's rays and use it to create heat, which then is usually used to create steam to turn turbines and create solar power. A problem with solar energy is when the sun goes down, you can't produce electricity anymore, but different people are working on ways to store electricity. Tesla, a company owned by Elon Musk, is working on industrial-sized batteries that can store excess solar energy during the day so you can use it at night. And other people are coming up with new creative ways of trying to store renewable energy so it's more predictable and you can use it at night. So this is a picture of basically the amount of sunlight that hits the U.S. Essentially, areas that are in darker red receive more sunlight than areas that are not. Michigan is not exactly ideal for solar, but you can really use solar energy anywhere. Everywhere gets a little bit of sunlight. The more solar energy you have, the more sunlight you have, then the more electricity you can generate, and the sooner you can pay off the cost of the solar panels. So not surprisingly, the Southwest, Phoenix, New Mexico, Arizona and Texas, West Texas have good conditions for solar energy. And as you get further north and further east, usually they're not as ideal. Wind power is a rapidly growing form of energy. It's very common all over the U.S., especially in the prairie states, Texas, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and so on. There are also some large wind parks, as they're called, in Michigan, some in Gratiot County, which is right in the center part of Michigan, and also a large industrial wind farm in Huron County, which is in the so-called thumb region of our state. There has been a huge number of wind turbines that have been built in the thumb region, so many so that a lot of local residents have become annoyed by them. They complain about noise and light flicker and blinking lights at night and dead birds and other problems that can be caused by them. So there have been a reduction in the number of wind turbines that have been built in the thumb region because of local backlash against them, but they are still building them in other parts of Michigan. Mackinac City has 2 large wind turbines. Again, Gratiot County in the center part of the state has hundreds of wind turbines, and other parts of the state have them as well too. So again, wind power is about 4% of the energy generated in Michigan. That number may go up. depending on if the state can build up more wind turbines. So when we talk about each region, we're going to talk about population trends that are going on in the countries of each region. Now, North America is easy because there are only two countries that we're going to be talking about, Canada and the United States. When we get to Sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to see a similar chart that will have dozens of different countries. But for Canada and the United States, this is some of the basic demographic information about the people in the area. Canada has 34.9 million. The United States has about 320 million. This chart's a little old, probably 325 million nowadays. Population density in the United States, including Alaska, there are 33 people per square kilometer. It would be even higher density if we didn't count Alaska. In Canada, it's much lower. They only have 3 people per square kilometer there. The natural rate of increase, meaning if you excluded immigration into the country, what would the population be? It's basically count the number of people born and count the number of people who die. What would the population be? In both Canada and the U.S. have very slow growth as a rate of natural increase. Most of the growth in both these countries that there is due to immigration. The U.S. and Canada have a population that's growing about 2.5% per year. Most of that is due to immigration, not necessarily people born in the country. Total fertility rate is the average number of children being born to women of childbearing age. So in the United States, the average woman would have 1.9 children. In Canada, it's slightly less. In order to have a stable population, you usually need to have 2.1 kids being born to each woman between the age of roughly 15 to 40. So if the U.S. did not have immigration, the population would most likely stabilize, then probably start to slowly decline. The percentage of each country that's urban, Canada it's 80%, the U.S. it's 79%. Again, that's people living in a city or metro area of 50,000 or more. The percent below the age of 15, Canada it's 16, the U.S. it's a little larger at 20. The percent above 65, Canada it's 14, the U.S. it's 13, and net migration rate per 1,000 people, basically how many people are migrating to the country. Canada it's relatively high at 5.6%, in the U.S. it's a little lower at 3.1%. It actually would be down slightly. This is information from 2012. Immigration to the U.S. has slowed a little bit. It's probably, at the moment, net migration is probably more like 2% now. So again, this is basic demographic information that we'll be talking about with each of the regions that we'll be looking at. So this is modern spatial demographic patterns of North America. What we have here is people per square kilometer, areas that are darker red are areas that are denser and more built up. And as you can clearly see, the eastern part of the U.S. is more heavily populated than the western part. When you get west of the Mississippi, there's not as much water, it's more lightly populated. And when you're east of the Mississippi, roughly, the cities are larger, usually a little older, and a more even population. You can see some of the largest metro areas are Los Angeles in the southeast, and New York in the northwest, Chicago in the central part of the U.S. And in Canada, most of the population is close to the U.S. border, with some large cities such as Calgary and Edmonton that are a little further away. So this is interesting. This is a picture of the United States at night. And you can see basically large metro areas, not surprisingly, give off a lot more light than more rural areas. If you look at areas out west, there's often very little light because there are very few people with lights on, not as many cities, not as many cars, not as many street lights, and so on. So you can clearly see where the people live by looking down at the U.S. from space at night. This here is the Detroit metropolitan area there. And of course this here is Chicago. A little bit north of Chicago is Milwaukee. This here is Minneapolis, St. Paul. And you'll notice in the middle part here there's this yellow blob. There's no city there. That is actually the Bakken oil and natural gas field that we talked about. Oil and natural gas wells sometimes have excess gas that comes out of them, and they burn it off so it doesn't go into the atmosphere. So all that light coming from the western half of North Dakota are large numbers of mostly natural gas wells that are burning excess natural gas at night to the point where you can clearly see it from space. So here is a picture of the largest city in the U.S. by far, New York City, population of about 8.3 million people. In the U.S., large numbers of people live in large metropolitan areas such as the Detroit metro area, which is about 4.5 million people. Detroit was at one point one of the largest cities in the U.S., probably one of the top 6 or 7, but it has declined, and now I think it's roughly number 15 or 16. The largest is New York, followed by LA, Chicago, Houston, and then I believe Philadelphia and Phoenix are very close, and then San Jose is up there, and Dallas is also up there. So some of the biggest cities are in Texas and California, and New York is the largest by far. So there's an uneven pattern of distribution. Larger cities are often on the coasts, and heavily populated areas are generally more in the east. And then as you move beyond the Mississippi into the Rockies, there aren't as many large cities because it's a little drier. Denver is one of the big exceptions. And when you have lots of large cities that bump into each other into one very large metro area, that's called a megapolis. That's essentially numerous different metro areas bumping into each other. So Washington, D.C. up to Boston, often called the Eastern Seaboard, is one megapolis. You don't see any rural wilderness or rural areas there. It's one massive city leading into the next, New York. Then as you go south, with D.C., you go north to Baltimore, then eventually Philadelphia, then New York, then Boston, and lots of large metro areas on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. So this is showing the pattern of settlement in North America. And as you can see, most of the major settlements in the mid-1750s were on the east in what was the original 13 colonies, and also on the St. Lawrence Valley. That's where Quebec City and Montreal are located. The East Coast had some advantageous harbors. The West Coast did not have as many, so it wasn't as heavily populated. Interestingly enough, here, the Rio Grande is Santa Fe. Santa Fe is one of the oldest European settlements in North America, founded in 1607, about the same time Jamestown was in Virginia. So in the mid-1700s, you can see the eastern seaboard was settled, and then about 1750s to 1850s, European expansion moved into roughly the edge of Missouri and Arkansas, a little bit past the Mississippi River, and then the rest of the areas in yellow were settled in roughly 1910. By 1890, the census that was taken in 1890 determined that there was no more frontier in America. There was no real clear line between what was settled and what wasn't. By then, railroads had crisscrossed most of the countries, and there were small towns out west, and then what we think of as the frontier had largely disappeared. So the movement is generally from the east towards the west, with some exceptions in the Santa Fe area in what is now New Mexico, and the San Francisco Bay Area, which had small settlements in the 1850s. So there's been this continuous westward and southern movement of different populations in North America. There's also a significant exodus of blacks from the South during World War I and World War II towards the north, towards Detroit and Cleveland and some other major industrial areas. There's been recently a movement of rural to urban areas. A lot of small towns across America have been losing population, moving to larger cities. And there's also been a significant amount of growth in the Sun Belt, roughly the southern half of the U.S., especially since the end of World War II. One of the main reasons for that is the creation of practical air conditioning. Before the World War II, very few places had practical, affordable air conditioning, and after World War II, a lot of big cities like Miami, Houston, Dallas, Las Vegas, that might have been too uncomfortable for large settlements, became much more pleasant after air conditioning became common in all new homes. So this is an example, this picture here of an unfinished subdivision in Tucson, Arizona. There was a major housing boom that started in the 90s, went through the mid-O's, and then about 2008 collapsed during the Great Recession. Many parts of the U.S. have recovered from that. There are even some areas where there are housing shortages, but it's been a very uneven recovery. there are still some subdivisions in different parts of the U.S. that are still in low demand or half built even years after the end of the Great Recession. So this is an interesting picture. This shows the mean center population of the United States. This basically means if you look at the U.S., excluding Hawaii and Alaska, which would skew everything, and you look at what the mean center point is, what the middlemost point would be for the population, in 1790 would have been roughly where Delaware is, and then it would have been slowly moving towards the west, then slowing down in the early 1900s through the 1940s, then picking up significantly after World War II, and then taking a slight dip to the south. And now the mean center point in the U.S. as of 2010 would be south central Missouri, and that means that's sort of the average center point of people living in the U.S. So this is a continuous pattern from east towards the west, and then after World War II, a shift down slightly towards the south as more people moved to the Sun Belt. This is when we had a major building boom in freeways, and a lot of the big cities that are in south, such as Atlanta, Miami, Houston, and so on, were really growing and still are growing. So during World War I and also after World War II, and during and after World War II, there was a movement of African Americans from the south, the southeast, towards the north. There was high demand for labor after World War I especially. And in 1900, about 90% of blacks lived in the South. Today, about 55% live in the South. So big cities like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland and big industrial cities often had many African Americans moving to those locations during World War I and World War II to take jobs in factories to meet the big demand there was for the growing industrial base of our country, especially in World War I and World War II, and then during the 1950s afterwards. I think this is kind of an interesting picture. These are some black children in the South, probably in the 1930s, judging by the cars. And it's interesting how formally people dressed in the past compared to now. These are relatively young kids, but this guy's wearing a tie. The picture above has people in hats. People simply dressed more formally in the mid-20th century than people do now. Now people tend to dress very casually. But back then in the mid-20th century, if you're having your picture taken or going anywhere out in public, you often wore a suit and tie and jacket and tie, even if you're relatively young. So we talked a little about the rural to urban migration. There is a large percentage of Americans that lived in rural areas, and then starting in the early 20th century, mechanized farming reduced the need for the number of people who worked in farms, and there is a movement from rural areas towards cities starting in the late 1800s and continuing to today. 1800, 55% of people lived in cities over 2,500. Now about 80% live in cities over 2,500. Again, large mechanized farms were responsible for much of this. There just aren't as many people who make their living on farms and ranches, and some of the towns have lost a lot of population because of this. This here is some old towns, or what's left of some old towns in North Dakota. My mom was actually born in North Dakota in the 40s, and North Dakota had a larger population then than it does now. And some of these small farming towns have just been abandoned because there are very few jobs. Medium-sized cities to larger cities are doing better. And this is something that's fairly common throughout much of the Midwest and the U.S. as smaller towns sometimes struggle to keep and retain young people that tend to move to cities where there are more economic opportunities and there's more appeal. This is actually a global phenomenon as well. In other countries, in other places such as Latin America and parts of Africa and Asia, this is even more pronounced as almost entire villages are being depopulated as people move to rapidly growing cities such as Lagos in Nigeria, or different cities in the east coast of China, or Shanghai in southern China and in eastern China, and so on. So rural to urban migration has been slowly happening for about 100 years and has been picking up pace, especially in developing countries in the last 40 to 50 years. So this is an example of somewhat of a typical Sun Belt city, a car-centric city. This, I believe, is Orlando on the top. I'm sorry, I believe that's, one moment here, that's Miami. And the South, especially since the 1970s, has grown significantly, and most of the transportation has been focused on cars. Not as much has been invested in the subway lines and light rail lines, although that is starting to change. A lot of cities all across the U.S. now, starting 10 or 15 years ago, have started investing in mass transit. But from the 50s through the 70s and 80s, almost all development was focused around cars and freeways. During the 1990s, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and Texas grew by more than 20% each. This is when Michigan's population was relatively flat. The bottom picture is one of the fastest growing cities in the U.S. It's called The Villages in Florida. And this is basically a planned retirement community that has been built recently, and it's kind of built in a way that kind of mimics an old-timey downtown. They deliberately make buildings look old-fashioned, and they make it very accessible to golf carts. So you can drive around everywhere and park in golf carts because this is less expensive than having to own a car. So this is a city of about 110,000, and it's growing very rapidly. A lot of the people who move there are people from the Midwest who move down south to escape the cold winters, and then they wind up in these retirement communities and planned communities like The Villages. So a typical pattern that many U.S. cities have grown in the U.S., especially in the 20th century, is very often you'll have a downtown old city center that's pedestrian and a horse car center. Detroit follows this pattern. Chicago does too. The older parts of Detroit are near the Detroit River. Detroit in the mid-1800s was a relatively large town, very walkable, and you take horse carriages everywhere or walk everywhere. And then they actually had some horse carriages that were pulled along rails, kind of like light rail lines now, except they were pulled by horse carriages. Then in the late 1800s, many electric streetcar lines were built starting in the 1880s, and then they kind of extended out from the city center. And where you have streetcar communities, you often have old homes that have lots that are relatively close together and then go back a ways. The idea was the homes wanted to be close to the streetcar line, so you had narrow homes bunched close together that had long backyards. And some areas in Detroit are like this today and elsewhere. And then what happened is the automobiles became common in the early 20th century to the mid-20th century, and then they became more diffused and spread out. And then starting after World War II, there was a large growth of freeways, and that really led to suburban sprawl and exodus of people, especially middle-class people, from city centers into the suburbs starting after World War II. Again, Detroit's an example of that. Now this trend is somewhat reversed or maybe stabilized, and many downtown city centers are growing at or even faster than some of the suburbs around them. Downtown Detroit is actually doing quite well. There's a major building boom there, and other suburban communities like Southfield are struggling with low rents and other issues because downtown Detroit's doing fairly well. So somewhat of a movement back into the city center, away from the suburbs in some places, and other suburbs are still growing. So this is kind of interesting. This is a picture of what mass transit was like in Detroit in the 1870s. Top picture on the left is horses pulling a car on rails with the passengers behind them. And then starting about the 1880s, on the top right, you can see these streetcars became electrified. 1880s and 1890s, early 20th century, they had electric streetcars that crisscrossed many large U.S. cities. And then the bottom left shows cars becoming more common. Starting in the 1950s and 60s, some streetcar lines were ripped up and dismantled because they got in the way of the cars, and cars were considered progressive and forward-thinking, and light rail lines were an antiquated mode of transit from the past and weren't needed. And then in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, massive freeways were built that really expanded rapidly the growth of cities and led to people fleeing downtown urban areas to the suburbs. And these are some examples of somewhat of a reversal of that. The top left picture is a light rail line in Minneapolis. They have a light rail line extending from Minneapolis to the Mall of America and an airport. They've just built a new light rail line linking downtown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul. Top right is Phoenix. They have a light rail line linking the airport with downtown Phoenix. Bottom left is Los Angeles, which is in the middle of a massive mass transit boom. They have been investing for 15, 20 years in mass transit, and they're continuing to build up their mass transit network. And the bottom right is the Q line, which is Detroit's relatively tepid step into mass transit. It is a 3-mile line that basically links downtown Detroit with Midtown and the Amtrak station 3 miles north of the downtown. So it's not real long, but it's been pretty successful so far. It's very well placed. It's near a lot of the museums in Detroit, and it's near Wayne State University, where you have a lot of students. It's near the downtown. The Pistons and the Red Wings and the Tigers and the Lions all play within walking distance of the Q line. So far, it's only been operational for about 6 months, but it's been fairly popular. The first few months it was free, and then after about 4 months they started charging about $1.50 per ride, and then ridership dropped 40% once they started charging, even though it's only $1.50 per ride. So you kind of wonder if it's even worth collecting a toll. Maybe they should just make it free and find some other way to pay for it, like a sales tax or a property tax. That last slide was a BRT, bus rapid transit system, and those are common in Cleveland and in some other cities. They're somewhat like light rail, but they're buses and dedicated lanes instead. This here is an example of some edge cities. An edge city is a city kind of like Southfield. It's sort of a city that grew up on the outskirts of an old city center, usually near a freeway. Tyson Corners, Virginia, and the middle picture is an example of that. And Pittsburgh's South Side Works neighborhood is another example of an edge city. And then on the bottom right is Southfield. These are cities that are very car-centric, usually close to freeways, that grew in the late 20th century. So many places in the United States have had a high demand for people, especially young people, to live in the downtowns near where most of the jobs are. And New York and San Francisco are notorious for having incredibly high rent, but elsewhere as well, downtown city centers are becoming increasingly popular, especially for young people and baby boomers, people who don't necessarily need a lot of space because they don't have large families. And this is an example of a micro apartment that is currently being built in Detroit called 28 Grand. This has about 400 square feet. Many of these are fairly well designed. A lot of them have Murphy beds that flip up when you're not using them and flip down when you are using them. And even cities like Kalamazoo have had micro apartments that have been built as small as 300 square feet. So the original idea was, oh, this will be popular for really expensive cities like San Francisco, but it's not going to fly in the Midwest. That has not been the case. There are micro apartments in St. Paul, Minnesota, near the new light rail line I mentioned earlier, that are about 400 square feet and renting out for $1,000 a month. And that's in St. Paul, Minnesota, not exactly an expensive city like San Francisco. So if they're near jobs and if they're near good mass transit, there's often a high demand for apartments, even small apartments in downtown city centers. So settlement in rural North America compared to other areas. In North America, we have something that we're all used to, but it's somewhat unusual, where you have rigid rectangular patterns all across the landscape. Michigan is divided up into counties. Those counties are divided up into townships. Those townships are further divided up into rectangles. And on the bottom right, we have an example of a small town in Iowa. You can see here that everything is very rectangular. And that is basically done because surveyors moving into the Midwest saw all this open land and wanted an efficient way of dividing up, so they divided it up into counties and townships and so on, and then sold plots of land in square miles or quarter miles or so on. Square miles in farming is often referred to as a section. My grandfather farmed a section in Minnesota. And on the bottom left is what European land distribution in rural areas were like in England, very haphazard. It's much older. You know, people just would measure from one stone to an old tree to someone else's property line to a creek. Not rectangular at all, very haphazard, probably a little less efficient and less ideal for large-scale mechanized farming. But this just goes something we take for granted in Michigan, having these large rectangular plots and large rectangular counties. That's fairly unusual in Europe and even relatively uncommon in eastern parts of the U.S. if you look at the counties in Michigan compared to the counties in, say, Georgia or elsewhere, they often look very different. They're very rectangular in Michigan and not so much elsewhere. So here is another picture of Michigan, and you can see we have 83 counties, and they're often rectangular or close to it. And on the right we have Jackson, and Jackson is divided up into numerous 6-mile by 6-mile townships. Sandstone Township is 6 miles by 6 miles. Concord, Hanover. These are all 6 miles by 6 miles. And this was done basically just for simplicity's sake, to make it easy to divide up the land and sell the land to settlers and farmers. So cultural coherence and diversity, shifting patterns of pluralism. The U.S. has, mostly because of immigration, had a steadily increasing population and an increasing non-white population. Asian, Latino populations especially have been growing significantly. White, African American, and American Indian have been relatively stable, but the big growth over, since say the 1970s, has been the rise of Latinos and Asians coming to the United States. We are the most significant country in the world culturally, globally, and economically. And because of that, this has made the U.S. A place that many people still like to immigrate to. At the moment, the population of Americans who are white is about 66%. That is projected to drop to about 48% by 2050. Some of that is misleading because Latino is a very broad category. Many people who are Latino have ancestors who are European, just like those in the U.S. So a large number of the Latinos might have ancestors from Europe, like anyone in the U.S. would. And this also considers people who are perhaps mixed race, maybe part Asian, part white, to be a minority, when in fact they would be just as white or European as they would be a minority. For instance, Barack Obama had a mom who was white and a father who was African from Kenya, and he's generally considered by society to be black or African American, when in fact he's just as white as he would be black. And that's how it is with many minority groups. We as a society kind of think of someone as a minority, even if they might be 50 or 60% European. So although it looks like on paper whites would be less than half the population, large numbers of people who might be classified as Latino or Asian could be mixed race or part white or have ancestors who are European as well. So this also assumes that migration patterns and immigration continue as they have been on average for the last 8 years. Immigration could increase or decrease, and these projections could be off by a little bit. But the general projection is by 2050, whites would be a little less than half the population, and Latinos and Asian Americans would be a little higher. So this is the Peopling of America, U.S. immigration by year and group. Immigration in the U.S. has had many peaks and valleys and many increases and decreases. During the 1800s, it was relatively low compared to later on, and then there was a bump in the 1850s, then kind of up and down in the 1800s, and then during the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a significant increase, especially from people from Southern and Eastern Europe, Greece, Italy, Poland, and so on. Previously, most people from North America had come from the British Isles or northern parts of Europe. And then there's a decline in the 30s and 40s with the Great Depression and World War II, and then a steady increase, and then a big increase starting in roughly the 70s when the U.S. changed its immigration policy to allow for a much larger group of people from all over the world to immigrate to the U.S. And that's when you had a big increase in people from Asia and Latin America. And as of 2010, the annual immigration to the United States was probably about 1.2 million. Trump would like to reduce the level of legal and illegal immigration into the United States. It's difficult to see if that would happen. Many people, even Republicans, like immigration because The larger number of immigrants you have, the greater demand there is for housing, which is generally good for the economy. Often there's a larger labor pool, so wages for better or for worse are often lower, making it easier to hire people. But it can also drive down wages and increase rent significantly. So immigration has some good things and bad things related to it. It usually means cheaper labor, but it also can mean cheaper wages, lower wages, and housing shortages if you have populations growing faster than the ability to accommodate them. So it's a controversial issue, always has been, and most likely always will be. So this is an example of Hispanic and Asian U.S. populations, and they're not evenly distributed around the country. Certain groups are more likely to congregate in certain states. Hispanics are largely centered in California, Texas, and Florida. That's over half the Latino population is in those three states, also some in New York and elsewhere. And Asian populations, Asian Americans, are heavily concentrated in California, New York, Texas, New Jersey, and Illinois, especially in California since it's on the Pacific. So there's a growing Asian and Hispanic population in Michigan and in the Midwest in general, but they generally are concentrated in California and with Latinos, Texas and Florida and New York. So Canada has actually a large number of immigrants. In fact, Canada has a larger percentage of their citizens who were born outside the U.S. than the U.S. does. Canada has probably about 13 to 14% of its citizens born outside of Canada, while in the U.S. it's about 11 to 12%. Many Europeans' immigration was dominated by the French early in Canada's history. Quebec was settled by the French. Today, 60% of Canada's immigrants are from Asia. A large number of Chinese immigrants have moved from China to Canada. Vancouver is a very popular destination. And this has actually caused some problems. Many Chinese looking for a safe place to park their money outside of their country will buy real estate in Vancouver and to some degree Seattle and elsewhere, but Vancouver's notorious for it. And they often won't even live in these apartments. They'll just buy land, build a huge house, and then keep it as an asset that will presumably go up in value. And then they can live in it if they want to or sell it for a profit. This has led to very high housing costs. And similar things are going on in New York. There are skyscrapers that have been built with often foreign, Chinese, and Russian money that are vacant because they're thought of more as an investment rather than a place to live. And elsewhere in the U.S., foreigners, especially from China and Russia, have often bought apartments and real estates and built them as an investment, and it's leading to higher rent and housing shortages that's causing some problems. So cultural place in North America. North America, both the U.S. and Canada, is very diverse. When people who have a similar background congregate in a similar area, sometimes that's called a cultural homeland. An example of that would be such as French Canada, like Quebec. There are large Latino populations along the U.S.-Mexican border. In New Orleans, there's a large population of French Canadians that moved down to New Orleans in the 1700s called Acadians. They speak a dialect of French, and they have a very unique culture in New Orleans. So these large enclaves of ethnicities are sometimes called a cultural homeland. Greektown, Detroit has a small cluster of Greek people living downtown in a neighborhood called Greektown. There's also a Mexican town in Detroit that has a population of about 16,000 people, Latinos who have moved there in the 80s and so on, and those might be considered small versions of cultural homelands. So again, French Canada has a unique language. The French settled along the St. Lawrence River in the 1700s. Quebec City, I haven't been there. I heard it's very beautiful. It's the only walled city in North America. A wall was built around the city to protect it from attack. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the Hispanic borderlands in the south along the U.S.-Mexican border, Acadia near New Orleans, and Native American populations are examples of cultural homelands. The Navajo have a large amount of land land in Arizona and New Mexico, where they still speak their native languages and much of their original culture is preserved. These are some interesting murals that were in San Francisco and Detroit. I went to San Francisco about 4 years ago on vacation, and the two pictures on the right are in San Francisco. And there is an old part of San Francisco called the Mission District that has a large Latino population. And they are concerned that a lot of entrepreneurs and tech people are moving into this area, driving up rents, and many people are fearful of getting priced out. So you'll have a lot of anti-gentrification graffiti in this part of San Francisco, the Mission District. The two pictures on the left are murals that have been built in a Mexican town in Detroit. And I haven't seen those two, but they're very interesting, kind of celebrating the agricultural history and culture of Mexican Americans in Detroit. The picture on the top right is one of the older African American churches in Oakland, California. And then the picture on the bottom left shows a picture of sometimes the poverty that rural Native Americans have to endure. Many of them are in isolated areas far away from city centers with inadequate education and health care, and sometimes there's high rates of alcoholism and large rates of unemployment. So some Native Americans populations, especially in rural areas, have struggled with poverty and unemployment. This is an interesting picture of some of the, you could call cultural homelands or regional ethnicity in North America. Again, we talked about French Canada here. In many parts of the southeast, there was an area called, or still is called, the Black Belt, where many African Americans settled in the 1700s and 1800s, areas that was ideal for growing cotton, which is a very thirsty crop. It needs a lot of water. Areas in the southeast were ideal for growing cotton, so slaves were brought over to work on plantations in this area. And then this is where many blacks moved away from starting in the 20th century to take industrial jobs further north. Also, you can see there's a Navajo reservation in the southwest and a large number of Latinos living along the U.S.-Mexican border. There's also a large Cuban-American population in Miami. Many Cubans fled Cuba in the early 1960s when Castro took over. So there's a large Cuban-American population in Miami. So this is an example of kind of the demographic breakdown of Los Angeles, and you might have a similar pattern in other big U.S. cities. There are many neighborhoods where there's no majority population, and others where it's largely Hispanic, white, African American, or Asian, and it's a large, complicated mosaic of different peoples and cultures. Interesting thing about Los Angeles is actually has been booming and on a roll lately. In the 80s and early 90s, they've had lots of problems with crime and gangs and so on, but the crime rate has declined, and the homicide rate in LA is about a quarter of what it was in the late 80s and early 90s. And they're suffering from some of the same things that New York and San Francisco are: lack of housing, gentrification, the price of homes going up, people not wanting to build new apartments because they're afraid that the suburban style of their neighborhood will be ruined by high-dense housing, sometimes called NIMBY, not in my backyard. For instance, if a neighborhood has mostly single detached homes and there's a surface parking lot, a developer might come and want to turn that parking lot into apartments, and then many of the locals don't want it because they think it will disrupt the feel, or it will be out of place with the homes that are already in the area. So sometimes it's very difficult to build housing because the people already in a neighborhood don't want new housing built for various reasons. But this is an example of a very diverse city. Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the U.S. So this is kind of interesting. There's been a mix of U.S. culture with global culture, and sometimes it's led to some rather funny things. A mix of influences is shown below. Sometimes there's a mixing of English and Spanish, sometimes called Spanglish, and there's sometimes a mixing of Chinese and English in different parts of China called sometimes Chinglish. And in China, often they will hire people to translate who must have slept through class and didn't know what they're doing. And these are some funny signs that were in China of poorly translated signs. Deformed person, exclusive use, rather than say handicapped accessible. To abuse plastic bag, please pay money each $2. I don't know what that means. I think it's supposed to mean you have a $2 fine if you litter a plastic bag. Here are some other funny ones. Hand grenade, that looks like a fire extinguisher. I don't know how that got there. And then execution in progress. Again, they must have hired the cheapest translator they could find, because this is way off. So globalization has led to mixing of cultures. This is just an example of annual beer imports to the U.S. from 2010. And this is actually somewhat dated, because the microbrew industry in the U.S. since 2010 has grown significantly. Jackson has a microbrew that's been around for about 3 years. In Kalamazoo, you have Arcadia, and you have Bell's Oberon. In Grand Rapids, it's one of the most famous beer cities in the U.S. You have Founders. So the U.S. beer scene has grown significantly in the last 7 years, but at the time this slide was taken in 2010, the U.S. was importing a lot of beer from elsewhere. This kind of shows where we were getting beer from. You may have heard of Victoria Bitter. Australia, they say Victoria Bitter, Australian for beer. I was a student in Australia for 5 months, and very few people there actually drink Victoria. I'm sorry. Foster's is the beer that is best known in the U.S. And came from Australia. Very few Australians drink Foster's. Most of the people in Australia drink Victoria Bitter or Tooheys, another kind of beer. They call it VB. They want to go down to the university and drink a VB. I mean, Foster's is like a joke swill beer. It's like the Milwaukee's Best of Australia. So this is an example of different kinds of beer that have been imported to the U.S. and where they're from. So North America is home to 2 of the world's largest states, the U.S. and Canada. Canada is the second largest country land-wise. The U.S., including Alaska, is a little smaller than Canada. The largest country in the world land-wise is Russia, which is about twice the size of Canada. So these 2 countries together, along with Mexico, are part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And these 2 states are federal states, meaning that they have levels of government below the national level of government. In the United States, of course, there's the national government in 50 different states. And in Canada, there are numerous different provinces and territories. And these states and provinces are semi-autonomous from the national government, meaning they can hire their own governors for the provinces and states and so on. These 2 countries, the U.S. and Canada, are closely linked culturally and economically. The U.S.'s largest trading partner is Canada, and the biggest crossing point between the U.S. and Canada is the Detroit-Windsor border. You may have heard about the new bridge that they're building along Detroit, between Detroit and Windsor, called the Gordie Howe Bridge, named after the famous hockey player who played for the Red Wings, Gordie Howe. He passed away about a year ago. But this bridge is supposed to significantly increase traffic between the 2 countries, and to some degree it's already spurred development. Amazon has said they're going to be building 3 large distribution centers in the Detroit metro area, partly because of the geographic location Detroit has on the Great Lakes and with Canada. So the Detroit metro area is a major distribution and transportation hub in North America. So these are some of the geopolitical frameworks and different political issues that the region is dealing with in North America. Some of these we mentioned earlier. The U.S. has a border with Mexico, and President Trump is talking about building a wall along the border, which is somewhat controversial, but about a third of the border already has a wall or a barrier along it, most of which was built during the Obama administration. So when people talk about building a wall, maybe they should say continue building the wall, because there's already a significant barrier along much of the border. Also, much of the land that has a barrier on it is federal land, while much of the land that does not is privately owned. So if the U.S. wanted to build a wall, it would have to use eminent domain to take land away from the landowners, compensate them for it, and then build the wall, and that could be very time consuming. So it might be difficult to continue building the wall beyond what it currently is. But anyway, this talks about different geopolitical situations in the U.S. and disputes we've had with Canada. Canada has been selling large amounts of lumber to the U.S. that some people in the U.S. think is illegally inexpensive. It's called dumping. I don't think this is that unusual. Canada is a huge country with vast forests, so not surprisingly, they're probably going to have a lot of relatively cheap wood. But that's one political issue between the U.S. and Canada. We talked about invasive species in the Great Lakes. That's another issue. And there's also the U.S.'s relations with Cuba. Cuba's dictator Fidel Castro died about a year ago, and the U.S. under President Obama was working towards normalizing and improving relationships with Cuba, and now under President Trump that's not as certain. So we'll see if the U.S. and Cuba continue to improve relations, or if relations deteriorate. So this is a picture of the U.S.-Mexican and U.S.-Canadian border. The picture on the left is a portion of the U.S.-Mexican border, I believe in California, and much of the border has rusty metal kind of modular fences that are kind of put together almost like Legos in pieces. And the U.S.-Canadian border, on the other hand, is an open border, meaning there is no physical barrier. The only thing that signals the difference between the U.S. and Canada is this large strip of land that has been cut to signal where the border is in the forest. So the U.S. and Canada have a large, what's called unprotected border, where there's really no barrier preventing movement between the two countries. And then the U.S.-Mexican border is more heavily fortified and secured, although there's still a significant amount of smuggling that goes on, drugs and people and so on, along the U.S.-Mexican border. So 4 key issues related to North American immigration. There's disagreements concerning how many legal migrants should be allowed into the country. President Trump would like to reduce the number of legal and illegal immigrants into the country and reduce the number of refugees that our country accepts. Tightening daily flows of undocumented immigrants. We mentioned earlier we have already built a barrier along the U.S.-Mexican border along about 1/3 of the length of the border, and there's talk about continuing and extending that. Drug-related violence along the border between the U.S. and Mexico is a major problem. Juarez, Mexico is an incredibly violent city right across the border from El Paso, Texas, which is actually an incredibly safe U.S. city. El Paso, Texas has one of the lowest crime rates out of any city of its size in the U.S. And then right across the border, you have Juarez, Mexico, which is incredibly dangerous and violent. It's gotten slightly better in the last 2 or 3 years compared to how it was 4 years ago, but drug-related violence in Mexico is still a major problem. Thousands are killed in Mexico in drug-related feuds and so on every year. And then 4th, there's no political consensus on policy to deal with existing undocumented workers. There are many undocumented workers that were brought over when they were young, and they're covered by an executive order called DACA. And President Trump has thought about rolling that back or challenging it, in which case about 600,000 people in the country in this rather gray area as to whether they're here legally or not might be no longer allowed to stay in the country legally. So it's difficult to know what's going to happen there. Some of them were brought over by the parents when they were very young as 2 or 3 or 4. Many of them are soldiers and college graduates and elsewhere. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to the roughly 600,000 people who were sometimes nicknamed dreamers, who came over here as young people and have now been granted reprieve from Obama and allowed to stay in temporarily legally, and that legal status might be revoked. So the U.S. has a significant global reach. Again, we are the largest, most powerful military in the world. In 1824, President Monroe signed something called the Monroe Doctrine that basically discouraged European countries from colonizing the Americas. He essentially said North and South America was the United States sphere of influence, and European countries should not colonize different areas in North and South America. This has been mostly honored. There are very few colonies or countries that are aligned with. There are some Caribbean countries that have close ties to European countries, but otherwise this was mostly honored. In World War II, after World War II, the U.S. emerged as the major world power globally, and that's when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed, NATO. This is a collection of countries that were originally designed and built to fight against the Soviet Union, and they're actually still a very important organization today. They conduct peacekeeping operations, and they keep an eye on Russia. The Soviet Union is gone, but Russia is still considered a threat. And then the OAS is Organization of American States, and those are countries made up of North and South American countries that are sort of like a mini United Nations. They meet to try to resolve disputes and promote free trade and promote peace and stability in the Americas. And currently the U.S. again has a major global presence. We've been in Afghanistan since 2001, and the U.S. currently has still about 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers there training Afghan troops and conducting patrols and basically acting as peacekeepers. And President Trump is kind of in the middle of deciding what the next plan is in Afghanistan. Are we going to increase troops, decrease troops? It's not entirely clear yet. So this is some demographic information about North America. The world's most powerful economy and its wealthiest people are in the United States and Canada. On the left, you see gross national income per capita. This is basically how much people make on average in a different country. 47,310 is the average for the U.S. Canada is slightly poor at 38,300. GDP average annual growth. This basically shows what the growth rate of Canada and the U.S. is, at least a few years ago. 2.0 and 1.8. That's probably has picked up a little bit since this chart was created. The Human Development Index is something that indicates human development related to education and healthcare and upward mobility. The higher the better. Canada's is 0.908, and the U.S. is 0.910. Life expectancy in Canada is 81 years, and the U.S. is 79 years. We have higher rates of gun-related deaths and suicides, and opium epidemic is a major problem in the U.S., also in Canada, but not quite as bad. So life expectancy in the U.S. is a little bit less than Canada, but still fairly high. Under age 5 morality rate. This is a little old, 1990, but Canada and the U.S. relatively low. Canada's a little better than us. Under age 5 morality rate 2010. The U.S. is lower than it was in 1990. Canada's is a little lower too. And then the gender inequality index. The lower it is, the better it is. The higher it is, the worse it is. This measures different things like percent of women who are in parliament or in government, percent of women who are in the workforce, percent of women who are married under the age of 18. You know, the higher that is, then the lower you are in the gender equality index. And Canada's is 0.14, the U.S. is 0.29. The U.S. Congress is only about 20% female. Canada's is much larger. And the U.S., the state government in Michigan is also only about 20% female. So things like that lower your gender inequality index, or I should say raise them and make it higher. So again, with the gender inequality index, the lower the better. So the U.S. and Canada have an abundance of natural resources such as lumber that we mentioned earlier, mining and extracting raw materials that are in demand globally for industrialization. Copper is always in demand, gold, silver, and so on. 3% of the U.S. economy is related to direct extraction of raw natural resources. Canada, because they have a larger land, is 6% of the Canadian economy. Australia has a large percentage of their economy that's related to direct extract of natural resources. Australia has a lot of coal and gold and silver and copper that they extract and then send to China, where China buys it. So Australia is very important to the economic well-being of China. They have close relations to each other. This is a chart that kind of shows major economic, industrial areas, and major sources of what the land is used for. This is a little easier to read in your book. Major agricultural and manufacturing activities in North America. The circles you see that have kind of hashtags in them are major industrial centers. Detroit and Cleveland is a major industrial area. Atlanta and Birmingham is a major industrial area. And then you also have a chart that shows where livestock ranching is common, where dairy farming is common. Michigan and Wisconsin would have a lot of dairy farming. Mixed farming, and essentially shows what much of the land is being used for when it comes to the economy in different parts of the U.S. So the United States and Canada has a high level of what's called connectivity. Connectivity is basically the infrastructure necessary to support a modern economy. It means having good ports, railways, communication systems, power grids, airports, way to transport goods and services, way to communicate, ways to provide electricity, and all of this infrastructure is referred to as connectivity. Sectoral transformation is a word that's used to describe the movement away from an area being dependent on one thing, trying to basically diversify its economy, trying to transform away from the Michigan, for instance, was very heavily dependent on cars, and we still are, but the states tried to move away from being so heavily dependent on just cars, and it's been somewhat successful, so that would be an example of sectoral transformation. And regional economic patterns refers to how different areas, economy, and people evolved around different geographic features of that area. For instance, New York City was founded where it was because they had a very large natural harbor that made it advantageous for ships and sailing. Boston also has a harbor. Detroit is founded where it is originally as a French trading post in 1701 because it was the narrowest point on the Detroit River. So if you could control that narrow strait, Detroit is French for the straits, or Detroit, then you could control access to the upper Great Lakes. So natural geographic features that help evolve the economy of a certain region are examples of regional economic patterns. Those are becoming increasingly less relevant as you know, people used to follow where the jobs are. Now, increasingly, jobs almost come to where the people are, and it doesn't matter as much the natural geography of a certain area compared to how it once did. You know, you can code on a computer almost anywhere. A lot of the economy is less dependent on geography compared to how it was. So regional economic patterns are becoming less important, but they're still somewhat important. The bottom picture is a picture of a large Gulf Coast petroleum refining center, and that's where crude oil is processed into more refined oil and then exported. So something like this would have to be on Gulf or near water access, and Houston has a lot of petroleum refining centers. So persistent social issues in the United States and Canada. Wealth and poverty is a major issue. We talked about how rent is incredibly high in many places, yet at the same time in rural areas they're losing population. There seems to be a mismatch between where people want to live and where the jobs are and affordable housing. Students are graduating deep in debt and struggling to get by. This is a picture on the top right of a gated community, an example of people who have wealth sometimes closing themselves off to the rest of the country. There are issues in the U.S. about gender inequality, and there's been a lot of talk about transgender rights when it comes to using bathrooms and so on, and also healthcare and aging. The last presidential election, Trump campaigned on repealing Obamacare, and now that he's elected, he's found out that's more difficult than it sounds, because a lot of people, even if they don't know it at first, have benefited from Obamacare. So at the moment that hasn't happened. But healthcare, a rising gap between rich and poor, are major issues in the U.S. The picture in the middle right is of Occupy Wall Street. That was a big grassroots movement about 5 or 6 years ago, where people upset at the financial problems during the Great Recession got together and protested against banks. It didn't do a whole lot, but it did help push for some modest banking reforms that are now possibly going to be undone under the Trump administration. So these are some examples of persistent social issues in the United States and Canada. So another issue that we've talked about before is immigration and foreign workers coming to the U.S. There are a fairly large number of temporary skilled workers, or H-1B visa workers, in the U.S. in 2010. Some of the major countries that had foreign workers working in the U.S. are displayed here. India, Canada, and Mexico were among the highest ones. And having foreign workers temporarily work in the U.S. is controversial because many Americans think that this drives down wages. In Florida, Disney hired a lot of Indian tech workers to come to the U.S. and more or less replace the entire U.S. force that they had, and that was very controversial. The idea behind it as well, we're driving down costs by hiring cheaper foreign workers, but then people in the U.S. are concerned that this might drive down wages or cost them their jobs as well. So having temporary skilled workers is somewhat controversial, and this is an example of where many of the people who are temporary foreign workers are from. India and Canada are two of the main sources of workers. So different organizations are trying to encourage global integration of the economy. The World Trade Organization, the G8, are organizations that try to promote free trade and mediate trade disputes between different countries and encourage doing business globally. Many businesses have engaged in outsourcing. This is basically when you move a factory typically to another country where labor is cheaper and land is cheaper and you can make your products for less money. Many U.S. car companies have outsourced many factories to Mexico or elsewhere, but there have also been many other countries that have outsourced their factories to the United States. Many Japanese car companies and German car companies like Toyota, Honda, and Mercedes-Benz have large factories in Ohio and Tennessee and Georgia and the Carolinas because land and labor is cheaper in the U.S. than it is in Germany or Japan. So this is kind of a double-edged sword where sometimes the U.S. benefits from outsourcing if Japanese and German car companies build plants in the U.S., but sometimes U.S. car companies move plants overseas or to Mexico, and that can cost jobs. So it's some good things and some bad things related to it. The picture here is of a major port in Seattle, and you can see they have these ubiquitous rectangular metal cubes, those storage containers that are now used all over the world. Those storage containers can be stacked on top of each other like blocks, moved into massive ships, and then moved anywhere in the world. And this is a very effective and inexpensive way of moving goods around the world. Then instead of having to unload all these containers, you can simply take them and place them on the back of a truck or on the back of a train, and then they can be transported without having to be unloaded. This is something that originated in New York in the 1950s, and it's one of the most important advancements in transportation and commerce of the 20th century, being able to have these large identical shipping containers that can be stacked, loaded onto boats, unloaded quickly without having to be emptied out. And this has significantly increased the speed of global trade and brought costs down. So let's talk quickly, go over some review of some questions. As a physical feature, the continent of North America typically includes all except. Now this is talking about, geographically speaking, what is North America. Our book classifies culturally and economically North America as North and South. It classifies it as the U.S. and Canada, but strictly from physical features, North America typically includes all except, and the answer is Colombia. That is part of South America. Canada, Mexico, Panama, and the United States are in North and Central America, considered to be part of the North American continent, but Colombia is part of South America. Canada is blank in land area than the United States, with a population blank. So is it slightly smaller but equal to the U.S. in population? And of these, Canada is slightly larger, but it is only 10% of the U.S.'s population. So it's a little larger land-wise, but about 90% fewer people, much more rural compared to the U.S. Which of the following statements is incorrect? And that would be C. The United States is the source of only 5% of the Earth's greenhouse gas emissions. Your textbook goes into a little more detail on this, but the U.S. is the source of approximately 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, even though we're about 5% of the global population. We consume a lot more energy than most other regions because we drive more, we have air-conditioned homes, we have much larger homes that suck up a lot of energy, and because of this, the U.S. is a source of roughly 20 to 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. China now emits more greenhouse gases than the U.S. does, mostly because of large numbers of coal-fired power plants. Low shrubs, grasses, and plants that thrive during a short growing season are characteristic of this high latitude biome. A biome basically means a large geographic region, and that would be tundra. Again, you have to remember it says high latitude biome. So a tundra is areas that are north of forests, north of green forests, north of boreal forests, where you don't have enough sunlight to support lots of plants, and you have lots of short shrubs and grasses and a very short growing season in cold weather. So that would be a tundra. Canada has large amounts of tundra in its northern parts. Canada's most populous city with 5.7 million people is, and that would be Toronto. Quebec City is fairly large, but not as large. Montreal, I believe, is the second largest city. Vancouver is also very large. And Ottawa is the capital of Canada. That is located in the province of Ontario. But Toronto is the largest city of 5.7 million people. The most persistent migration trend ongoing for 200 years is, so what is one of the consistent patterns in migration in North America that has been going on for 2 centuries? And that would be Western migration. African American exodus from the South happened starting in the early 20th century, World War I and World War II, but the westward migration has been going on steadily for 200 years. The population center has been moving from the East Coast towards the West, and now it's at roughly in central southern Missouri. Acadia, a rural homeland in the South, traces its cultural roots to, now this is the area we mentioned that was settled by the French in the mid-1700s. Basically, in the 1750s, Britain and French went to war in a war called the 7 Years' War, and the North American theater of this war was called the French and Indian War. And essentially they were fighting for control of North America, since both of them had colonies in North America. The British won, they drove the French out, and many people who were French, not wanting to live under British rule, left what is now Quebec, migrated down to what is now New Orleans, and became these French Acadian people that live in New Orleans. Today, the majority of Canada's immigrants are from, and that is Asia. We mentioned that there are many Chinese immigrants that have moved to Canada, and the Philippines is also a major center of immigrants, but China is the largest country where immigrants from Canada are from. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at wrenando@jccmi.edu. I've been enjoying reading the discussions that you have all posted so far, and reading the different articles that you've seen and your comments on them. So keep them coming, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And if you'd like, we could even set up a time for a video conference, if you would like, where we could talk via Skype or Blue Button through JNet. So give me an email if you have any questions. Thank you.